update for ornamentals crops. So really thinking about early spring pest management here, focusing on a couple of key pests at a time of year. Just to recap on integrated pest and disease management, not organic by any means. We're using conventional products in conjunction with bioprotectants. And we're always thinking about the safety of any interventions we're making, not only to humans, but to any biological controls we're introducing. So we're not wanting to apply anything that will have a negative impact on them. It'll impact on our pest control, focusing on healthy crops and proactively heading off problems. And all this helps us to reduce pesticide usage, but to get good results, you've really got to monitor weekly. And that is one of the key things you can do to get good results. Okay, so one of the key pests that's waking up at this time of year, key pest for nursery stock in particular, is two-spotted spider mite. I would say it's essential to have a hand lens for monitoring for this and other pests. The image at the top on the right of the screen there, you can see adult two-spotted spider mite, their eggs. And that's magnified, so they're smaller than that in real life. So times 10 or times 20 hand lens is an essential bit of kit, not expensive, widely available on the internet. So this pest's generally more problematic under protection. It does occur outside as well, a bit later in the season, normally outside. You've got a list of key hosts there. It's got a massive host list, so it will affect many other things. It thrives in hot, dry conditions, so growing conditions often are ideal for the pest as the temperature continues to warm up. And one of the keys to controlling this pest is preventing it overwintering. Now, if you've got it in your crops at the moment, it's likely to have overwintered from last year. So, thinking about the crop susceptibility and damage symptoms, as I say, it's more problematic under protection. A big host range, and really, I would say all nurseries should expect to get two-spotted spider mite on some susceptible crops. It can be brought in on incoming stock. It can blow in on the wind. So it's just a native pest that's out there, but it does very, very well on a lot of the crops we're producing. Sort of symptoms include leaf speckling, bronzing and yellow patching on the leaves. And when you get your eye in, it's very easy to spot the symptoms, and the symptoms start to show even at low levels of pest activity. So thinking about its life cycle and recognition, the key to sort of getting control and preventing it becoming a problem. Adult females will typically overwinter under pot rims, as you can see in this picture here, or in the crop or in the structure. They turn red when they go into diapause in the autumn, and the stage at which they enter diapause depends on the food quality of the host plant they're on and light levels. So that's a key that things are changing. Anyway, if you've got them gone into diapause and they'll be emerging now and active in the crops, laying eggs, these red females are basically egg laying machines, and don't try and spend any energy trying to kill them because it's pretty much impossible. We think they're pretty much resistant to all pesticides. We don't think they necessarily even feed. Their purpose is just to lay eggs before they die to start the next generation off. So we've got a couple of options for control of these eggs outdoors and under protection. So outdoors, you'll be looking to use a product called Apollo 50SC, which has got an EAMU number there. But just be aware this product is only contact acting. So unless you get contact of the eggs with the product, it won't necessarily kill them. And the eggs are likely to be on the underside of the leaves where this pest is typically found, and achieving good spray coverage on the underside of a leaf is a challenge. Also, Apollo does leave a magenta coloured deposit on the foliage, so not a product you'd wish to put on too close to marketing. Whereas under protection, you've got the option of Borneo, which is a product that also has activity against the eggs and the young motiles, so those are eggs that have just hatched. No nasty coloured deposits to worry about with this one, but it has a residual effect that persists for 45 to 60 days, and that will continue to work and kill any eggs, because the egg laying does go on for a period of time. So thinking about recognition, so here we've got some typical symptoms on a young laburnum tree in a pot, and you've got the flecking of the leaves starting, and that's at relatively low pest densities. And if controls aren't implemented, that will get worse. Eventually they'll look sort of quite bleached, chlorotic, and the pest can build up to numbers that result in it webbing and creating webbing between the leaves, and the pests will literally be dripping off, and that's their method of spread. They're naturally just spread in the wind, or as animals or people brush past them, they'll hitch a ride and end up on some other crops. So the adults are usually pale green, with a large dark spot on each side of the body. As I said, the emerging first generation of overwintered females are red, and that's why sometimes people will call them red spider mite, and they're the same thing we're talking about here. Young mites resemble the adults but are smaller. As I said, hand lens is a really essential bit of kit to monitor this pest and others. And, it's a useful bit of kit because when we come on to predators, you can start to tell the difference between predator and pest eggs, and that gives you an idea of your population dynamics, if you like, and the ratios of pests to predators, and those are the key to getting control. It's a pest that breeds rapidly in line with temperature, with a very short life cycle like most pests, and pests that have short life cycles are very prone to resistance, and the insecticides that we have got, a lot of those, I would say there's likely to be some levels of resistance. They don't seem to work as well as they used to in many cases, and we know that pests with short life cycles are capable of developing resistance. So diapause is the winter resting stage. It's brought on by reducing temperatures, day length, and reducing host plant quality, and it can be very marked. I've seen crops in the same structure, one which has a high level of spider mite, which is quite chlorotic looking, pale. They can go quite hard looking. They don't grow much, so the food quality of that plant was very poor. And I've seen spider mite going into diapause in those sort of September time, whereas on the same plant species in the same glass house, where there's a lower level of spider mite and the plant hasn't been damaged in the same way, the food quality is much better on the plant, and the spider mite is still actively breeding and not even thinking about going into diapause. So that's a factor that definitely has an effect. So for control, as I said, we've got some resistance problems. We haven't got many insecticides, and the few we have got, most populations of the pest have been exposed to, and sometimes they've been exposed to those too often, and that's why there's likely to be some resistance about. Borneo and Dynamec I talked about a few slides back. They're nice IPM compatible options to control eggs from overwintered adults, and the key to using those is to refer into the EAMUs, and the numbers are in the presentation here. Another option we got is Dynamec, which has some limitations. It doesn't seem to work as well as it used to. It is translaminar, so it'll move through the leaf. But a key thing to be aware of if you are using this product is that it breaks down very rapidly in bright sunny conditions, and shouldn't be used under such conditions because it will not perform. So it's a product that either needs to be applied on a dull day, or better still, late in the day, early evening when the sun's gone down, because even on a dull day, the clouds can suddenly disappear and out comes the sun and undoes your hard work of spraying. Another option is one of the biopesticides, or bioprotectants as they're now called, Botanigard WP, and this evidence suggests that the active in this has activity against spider mite. So that's another option. It's IPM compatible as well, doesn't have a big effect on the predators. But for control of this pest, most people now are moving to predators. They generally deliver the best control, and the most widely used of these predators is a predator called Phytoselulus persimilis, which is a pear-shaped bright orange mite, and it's a specialist predator of this pest. So it only feeds on two-spotted spider mite. It'll behave in similar ways. So if it starts to run out of food, in that it's eaten all the spider mite that are present, it'll move up the crop looking for more prey. And then if it's not finding anything, it's sort of relying on wind currents to carry it to try and find new food sources of a spider mite populations. It's larger than two-spotted spider mite with longer legs, and the key thing that we're interested in, it develops nearly twice as fast, and it feeds on all stages, including the eggs. Now, I notice in crops, it will quite often, when there's plenty of food about, it'll quite often feed on the adults and not necessarily clear all the eggs up at the start, whether it's a bit of a survival strategy, but they will come back and control those eggs or the eggs when they hatch as food source starts to decline. So as with any predator, you've got to get the right ratios to get them to perform. If it's like putting a lion on a plane with 1,000 wildebeest, if you haven't got enough, it's not going to make any impact. So the ratio you want to have in your mind, and it's the key ratio and key thing to remember from today's presentation, is 1 Phytoselulus to 10 two-spotted spider mite should result in good control. So when you're monitoring your crop and looking at your leaves with your hand lens, that's something to have in the back of your mind. And if you've got those sorts of ratios, you can be comfortable and confident that they'll deliver the results you desire and get control. If you're some way off that ratio, you could think about introducing more predators to top up the numbers to get those sorts of ratios to achieve control. Also, when you're monitoring through your hand lens, the Phytoselulus eggs are bigger than the two-spotted spider mite eggs, so you'll be able to get your eye in to see how many eggs are present as well. There are other predators that people use for control of two-spotted spider mite as well. One of them is Amblyseius californicus, which can be useful in very hot weather. Very hot weather, sort of over 30 degrees, doesn't always suit Phytoselulus persimilis. It can move down the crop and sort of seek cooler conditions. So introducing Amblyseius is an option and a useful one under hot summer conditions, but its release license limits its use to under glass, so it can't be used in tunnels. Just other things that you can do when conditions get very hot, which favour the spider mite and not necessarily the predators. Damping down paths is a useful technique to maintain some humidity and give you some evaporative cooling. Just be aware that can increase disease, the risk of disease, because most disease is like humid conditions, but it depends on the crop, and that's an assessment to make on the pest levels and the crop and its susceptibility to disease, really. So Phytoselulus persimilis will work at quite low temperatures, down as low as 10 to 12 degrees. And I would be encouraging you to introduce it weekly from now onwards on susceptible crop. The rate that you apply depends on the numbers of spider mite present. But even if you think your crops are clean, there might be the odd one lurking there. And I always say these predators are a far better scout than we are with a hand lens, because ultimately their life depends on it. So I think it's wise to go in at a low rate of, say, 2 per square metre to use this predator preventatively, even if you think your crops are clean, and that can work out much more cost effective than having to go in at the higher rates you can see there if things start to get out of control. And these low rates preventatively can stop exactly that happening. So high rates work well, up to 20 per square meter, and some people even use much higher rates than that to knock down hotspots, and people have found that's generally more effective than spraying in many instances and works very well. It depends on the crop. So if it's a liner crop that you're taking forward into next year, you've obviously got a bit more time, so you might not go in with such a high rate. Just keep that ratio in your mind, as I talked about in the earlier slide, 1 to 10. If it's a crop that's going to be marketable, you need to get control quickly before you get any damage, so you might choose to go in at higher rates. Sorry, just on that, knockdown sprays are another option. So the main one would be dynamic under glass. We haven't got many things for use outside really, so the use of predators, and the use of predators is something people are looking at and using very successfully on outdoor crops these days for control of spider mite, and that's using Phytoselulus and starting to reduce those outdoors from now on susceptible crops. So another key pest this time of year is aphids. We've got 4 main species that commonly occur in ornamental crops. They've each got a Latin name and a common name, so probably use common names for purposes today, but the Latin names are listed there. So you've got the peach potato aphid, and that's a range of hosts, some of which are listed. Glasshouse and potato aphid. And again, they've got the hosts listed there. There's images of each aphid species here next to the name, and that'll help to identify which species you're dealing with. So moving on to the next slide. Also got the melon cotton aphid there at the top. It can also occur in a darker form, and you'll often get populations containing adults that are coloured, as are shown there at the top of the screen, but you'll get darker adults as well in the population. And then the potato aphid at the bottom there, that's one of the easier species to control because that often affects the shoot tips, very soft growth, and it gives us a nice easy spray target to use some of the physical products such as Majestic and Eradicote that we'll cover a bit in the slides a little further on. So aphids' life cycle, they can overwinter in the crop or on a woody host, depending on the situation, but it's more likely that winged adults start to migrate into crops, particularly things like fuchsia that have started this season, and you'll see them appearing in the crops. Firstly, if you're really on the ball with your monitoring, you'll start to see the odd winged adult about, and then these will give rise to many more aphids. They breed rapidly and build up rapidly, giving birth to live young, which result in a big population quite quickly if they're not controlled. So the sort of damage you're likely to see with aphids when numbers start to build up is leaf yellowing and distortion. So on fuchsias, as I mentioned, you'll get distortion of the tips, the young tips, very quickly at relatively low numbers of aphids. So that's a key thing to look for when you're monitoring on that species. You'll get sticky honeydew. Basically, the aphids don't need all the sugar they get from the plant sap, so they drop that out of their back end as a waste product, and that sticky honeydew causes a sticky sort of shiny appearance to the leaf, which you can see in the image on the right, which is a geum. And this honeydew can produce other problems in that it can be colonized by sooty molds, which can turn it black and make the whole plant look even more unsightly. Also, we get cast skins as aphids molt going through their growth stages. So again, on the image on the right, you can see there are cast skins down in the base of the product. And even if you've killed the aphids, these detracts from the marketability of the product. So peach potato aphid and melon cotton aphid can also transmit viruses as well. So that's another factor as to why we're interested in controlling them and limiting their impacts. So control of aphids in integrated pest and disease management. Parasitoids, which are small parasitic wasps, typically introduced weekly at low rates under protection. We've got the rates there. They're generally used preventatively because they take a little time to work. So prevention is better than cure here. You can increase the rates and use them curatively, but if you start to get aphids hotspots, they're not necessarily going to give you the control quickly enough. So it's important to recognize that and think, right, what do I need to do instead? So aphid elites are another option that can be used curatively under protection. And they look very similar to a mosquito. They're a little midge, and they seek out aphid colonies, lay their eggs in there, and you get these small yellow maggots, or yellowy orange maggots that feed in the aphid colonies, and got rates of use there. Lacewing are another option. With these, you need to wait till you've got the pest present, so there's no point putting them in preventatively, and got rates of use there, and certainly interest in using these outdoor crops, and got a few people trialing that this year because we haven't got that many spray options for crops that are prone to aphids. Things like roses where aphids are a real problem. You can soon run out of sprays if you're thinking of using sprays, particularly IPM compatible sprays. So people are interested in trying these other predators. Ladybirds can be considered outdoors as well, and you'll get a lot of these predators occurring naturally if you're not spraying persistent pyrethroid type products, things like Hallmark, which have strong persistent residues that will prevent predators establishing. If these sorts of products aren't used, you will find you get native predators coming in and contributing to pest control. So just some IPM compatible insecticide options for aphid control. So we've got quite a few physical products at the top there, some of which I mentioned. Eradicote Max is a newer formulation of Eradicote, and it's fairly new to market. It may not be fully available yet, but when it does, it's probably worth switching to that one when you've used up existing stocks of Eradicote. You can see there are a limit on the number of applications for most of these products. Gazelle is one that's worth noting. It's a neonicotinoid, so some people are not able to use those because customers specify that they don't use any neonicotinoids in their crop protection programs. So we've got Aphox there. That's a carbamate insecticide, so some people can be sensitive to that, so that might be one to avoid if you're known to have sensitivity to it. But interestingly, we've got the insect resistance action code at the end there, and that gives the code for which insecticide group each product is in. So we've got products from different groups, which is good. So that prevents us creating resistant populations by spraying with the same thing. And where possible, it's good to alternate products and not spray with the same thing, particularly if it hasn't worked. So another thing to think about with using parasitoids for aphid control are a thing called hyperparasitoids. So these are a parasitoid that affects the parasitoid that's killing our aphids. So on the left, we've got the parasitic wasp that will lay its egg inside the aphid, and the resultant aphid mummy below, we call them a mummy because they blow up and look like a mummy. They seem to get a bit bigger. Anyway, you can see the exit hole on the image on the bottom left is nice and circular where a parasitoid has emerged, but where hyperparasitoid comes and lays its egg inside our parasitoid, it emerges with a jagged hole, and you can see that clearly in the bottom image on the right. So these parasitoids have been identified as a problem in some crops. So it's useful to use parasitoid mixes rather than relying on one species, such as Aphids colmanii, which is just one species of aphid parasitoid. Also, the mixes are likely to work better for most ornamental growers because you're likely to get different aphid species. So Aphids colmanii will generally parasitize smaller aphid species, where Aphids urvi will parasitize larger aphids. But by using a mixed product, it's giving you different parasitic wasps in there that target different aphid species, and it takes the hassle out of identifying down to aphid species, which can be a struggle for some growers. Banker plants can increase the risk of hyperparasitism occurring because they can be a breeding ground for hyperparasites. So generally discouraging people from using those these days, although it was seen as a way of saving money a few years ago, but we know it can increase the risk of hyperparasitoids now, which we don't want. So we need to be doing what we can to minimize the impact of these hyperparasitoids. So we're monitoring as weekly and looking at the exit holes on mummies to see whether you have got parasitoids or hyperparasitoids. Also, if you include aphid predators in your integrated pest management strategy, you'll reduce the risk of parasitoids developing. So down at the bottom right, we've got Aphids, the midge I talked about, and the orange sort of nymph that feeds in aphid colonies, and it's just tucking into an aphid there. Above that image, there's a release bottle just suspended in a crop. Top left, we've got a lacewing larvae feeding on an aphid, and bottom left is an aureus, which is normally used for thrips control, but it's quite a generalist predator. It'll feed on other things such as aphid and spider mite as well. So it's a useful thing to include in your control programs. And then if you start to get hyperparasitoids, you might think, right, it's time to go in with some insecticides to clear the problem up. If you take out the food source for the hyperparasitoids, so control all your aphids with a couple of insecticides, perhaps something like Main Man, you can break the cycle, as it were, and start afresh and go forward for the rest of the season. But if you do that, it's well worth keeping monitoring to check that you're not getting those hyperparasitoids occurring. Just another thing to touch on at this time of year, vine weevil larvae can be a problem. Nematodes can be used in the spring before the vine weevil larvae start to pupate. Ideally, you want to control any vine weevil larvae in the autumn, but sometimes things get missed, or treatment perhaps hasn't worked as well if a crop was a bit dry, and you might identify you've got some larvae in crops at this time of year. Minimising is a good product for use in nursery stock because it can be used for longer due to low temperature activities. It's active down to 5 degrees, whereas some of the other products are double that and a bit more, depending on the product. So it's a good option to use, particularly over winter, but as things warm up, you have got other options. So just some tips for controlling vine weevil larvae with nematodes. You need the larvae to be present. There's no point putting the nematodes on if they're not present. But saying that, in the autumn, most people tend to treat susceptible crops, even if they've got a level of larvae they can't detect. So it just ensures that they're dealt with. Follow product labels carefully. They've got lots of good information contained in them. Removing filters from spray application equipment or dosatrons is essential, because these can trap the nematodes and prevent them getting through. And we really need them to get through to do their job. You've got to keep them agitated in the spray tank or in the dosatron. Now, if you're applying from a dosatron, a simple method of keeping that agitation is gently stirring it with a bamboo stick, just to keep them agitated, and that keeps them mixed in that solution and prevents them settling out and drowning, which can be a problem. Apply them in the recommended amount of water and wash them off the foliage, because if they're lodged on the foliage after you've applied them, they won't do their job, because they need to get down to the growing media. So this can be done with either a light hand watering or a burst of overhead irrigation, depending on the scale of the area you've treated. Avoid application in sunshine, because they're sensitive to UV light, so getting them on in the right conditions to get the best results. And monitoring to see how well they've worked. So well worth checking known infested pots after 10 days. And depending on the product, you'll see the vine weevil larvae either going brown or red, which is the nematodes killing them. And important to make sure that growing media doesn't dry out completely for a couple of weeks post-application, because the nematodes swim through the growing media in a thin film of water, and they'll enter the vine weevil larvae through natural body openings. So they need that film of water to get about and do their job post-application. Thank you. That brings us to the end of today's presentation.
Thank you very much, Dave, for today's presentation. Just to let everybody know that, this is a programme we are running over sort of 10 months. So if anyone did want to join the IPDM network, please do email us at Tyfu Cymru and we can add you to that. We are looking at developing a WhatsApp group to support each the ornamental and the edibles. So again, let us know if you'd like to be added to that. Next month, we are looking at, am I right, Dave, in saying white flies and western flower thrips, and we'll be touching on capsids and leafhoppers will be mentioned, and that session is on May the 12th at 12 o'clock. So thank you all for joining us, and we hope to see you then.
Thank you. Bye.